The cold marble of the hallway pressed against Eliza's back, a chilling counterpoint to the heat of her shame. His breath, heavy with expensive whiskey, was a foul cloud around her face as he pinned her against the wall. He was one of them, one of the powerful men who owned this glass and steel world, a lieutenant drunk on his own authority. Her maid's uniform, a symbol of her invisibility, was torn at the shoulder, a violation that felt louder than any scream. His words were vile whispers, savoring the quiet terror in her eyes. She refused to plead, refused to break, her gaze fixed on a point just past his ear. Then, a shift in the air. The temperature seemed to drop, the lieutenant's smirk freezing on his face. A shadow fell over them, silent and absolute, and she knew he was there. But what happened in that silent hallway would shatter both their worlds, and if you watch until the end, you'll understand why. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The story of how a maid's quiet dignity brought a king to his knees begins with this moment, a single glance that changed the course of their lives forever. Her struggle was not just against the man in front of her, but against the darkness that had just arrived. He was the owner of this cage, and she had just caught his eye. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat, a promise of a reckoning that would spare no one, least of all the innocent. Eliza, at 28, had mastered the art of being unseen. As maid in Chicago's most exclusive residential tower, her existence was a series of quiet, efficient movements. She wiped away the fingerprints of the wealthy, polished surfaces until they reflected a life that was not hers, and disappeared before the owners returned. Her dignity was a silent, stubborn thing, woven into the precise way she folded a sheet or arranged a cushion. It was her only armor against a world that saw her as nothing more than a uniform. Haunted by the memory of her father's long illness and the mountain of debt it left behind, she moved through these opulent spaces with a grace born of sorrow, her loneliness a constant, invisible companion in the empty, echoing rooms. Her world was a cage of quiet oppression, its bars forged from financial desperation and the wearying demands of her job. Her supervisor, a woman soured by her own stagnant ambitions, scrutinized every task, her criticisms small, sharp cuts to Eliza's already frayed resilience. Each day was a tightrope walk between earning enough to keep the collection agencies at bay and preserving the last fragments of her self-respect. She saw the casual waste, the thoughtless luxury, and felt the chasm between their reality and hers. It wasn't envy she felt, but a profound sense of injustice, a quiet anger at a system that allowed some to have so much, while others fought for so little. She just wanted to be left alone, to work, to pay her dues, and to be free. The penthouse was a world of muted sounds and deliberate silences. The whisper of the climate control, the distant, muffled symphony of city traffic far below, the soft chime of the private elevator announcing an arrival. Her routine was a sensory map. The sharp, clean scent of ammonia, the faint, lingering aroma of expensive cologne on a discarded shirt, the cold, smooth feel of granite countertops beneath her cloth. These spaces were designed for power, their minimalist elegance, a testament to a life lived above the noise and chaos of the ordinary world. For Eliza, they were both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she could lose herself in her work but was constantly reminded of how small and insignificant her own life was in comparison. Beneath her calm exterior, Eliza carried the weight of a promise. She had held her father's hand as he faded, assuring him she would be okay, that she would be strong. That promise was the engine that drove her, the reason she endured the condescending glances and the crushing fatigue. His illness had taught her a bitter lesson about the cruelty of chance and the price of powerlessness. She fought not just to survive, but to honor the integrity he had instilled in her. It was a silent, lonely battle waged in the gleaming corridors of other people's lives, a struggle to keep a small flame of decency alive, in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it with its casual indifference and its suffocating gilded darkness. That day, however, the silence in the penthouse felt different. It was heavier, charged with an unseen current of tension. A half-full glass of dark liquor sat on a table that was usually pristine, its amber contents catching the afternoon light. The air was thick with the ghost of cigar smoke, an acrid scent of business and secrets. She had felt it the moment she stepped off the elevator, a subtle wrongness, a disturbance in the carefully controlled atmosphere. It was the feeling of a storm gathering just over the horizon, a premonition that the invisible walls she had built around herself were about to be breached. A low, slurred voice echoed from the master bedroom, and she knew her day was about to unravel. The city of Chicago woke to a symphony of steel and concrete, a grinding, impersonal sound that Eliza had learned to ignore. Her small apartment, tucked away in a brick building that had seen better decades, was her silent sanctuary. The 5 a.m. alarm was a cruel but necessary intrusion, pulling her from a shallow sleep into the pre-dawn chill. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, her bare feet silent on the worn linoleum floor. The ritual was always the same: a splash of cold water on her face, the bitter taste of instant coffee, and a long, quiet moment staring out at the sliver of gray sky visible between 2 taller buildings. It was a life measured in shadows and silence, a fragile piece she clung to before stepping out into the noise of the world, a world that demanded everything from her and offered so little in return. The bus ride was a daily exercise in forced intimacy and profound isolation. Pressed against a fogged window, Eliza watched the city come alive, a blur of anonymous faces rushing toward destinations that felt a world away from her own. She was a ghost among them, her presence noted by no one. The air was thick, with the scent of damp wool coats and stale coffee, a collective sigh of exhaustion before the day had even truly begun. She would often close her eyes and imagine a different life, one where she wasn't just a passenger but the driver, in control of her own direction. But the screech of the brakes at her stop always pulled her back to reality, a reminder that her journey was not one of choice but of necessity, a straight line from one cage to another. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit locker room, she would shed her own clothes, a simple, faded sweater and jeans, and don the uniform. It was a crisp, gray dress, severe and functional, designed to erase her identity. The moment the fabric settled over her shoulders, she became someone else, a function, not a person. She was a pair of hands, a silent presence meant to restore order and then disappear. The uniform was both a shield and a brand, protecting her from unwanted attention while simultaneously marking her as part of the building's machinery. She would check her reflection, not for vanity, but to ensure every trace of Eliza was gone, leaving only the polished, professional veneer of the maid, ready to face the silent judgment of the wealthy. Her supervisor, Mrs. Gable, ruled the service corridors with a quiet, simmering resentment. A woman whose own ambitions had long since curdled into bitterness, she found a small, cruel satisfaction in exerting her authority over the cleaning staff. Her inspections were meticulous, her criticisms delivered in a low, sharp tone that cut deeper than any shout. A single speck of dust on a marble mantelpiece or a streak on a glass door would earn a sigh of disappointment that felt like a physical blow. Eliza learned to anticipate these moments, to work with a relentless perfectionism that left no room for error. It was a silent war of attrition, a daily struggle to maintain her dignity against the relentless tide of petty tyranny that sought to wear her down. The pressure wasn't just at work. It followed her home, arriving in thin white envelopes with transparent windows. The medical bills from her father's illness were a relentless ghost, a mountain of debt that seemed to grow larger no matter how many hours she worked. Each letter was a fresh wave of anxiety, a reminder of her powerlessness. She worked double shifts, sacrificing sleep and any semblance of a personal life, all to chip away at a sum that felt insurmountable. This financial prison was more confining than any physical space, shaping every decision, dictating every waking moment. Her father had died believing she would be free, and the bitter irony of her current bondage was a weight she carried in the deepest parts of her heart. Sometimes, in the quiet opulence of the apartment she cleaned, she would see glimpses of the life she once dreamed of. An architect's drafting table, covered in blueprints and sketches, would make her pause, a pang of longing echoing in her chest. She had loved to draw, to imagine spaces filled with light and purpose. Or she would run a gloved finger over the spine of a leather-bound book in a vast, silent library, remembering the escape she once found in stories. These moments were small, secret rebellions, a quiet acknowledgement of the woman who existed beneath the uniform. They were painful reminders of a path not taken, of a potential suffocated by circumstance, but they also fueled a tiny, stubborn spark of hope that her story was not yet over. Her mother's nightly phone calls were a fragile lifeline and another source of quiet obligation. Her voice, thin and anxious, would travel through the receiver, filled with questions about Eliza's health, her job, her safety. Eliza always answered with a carefully constructed cheerfulness, painting a picture of a life that was stable and secure. She never spoke of Mrs. Gable's cruelty, the crushing exhaustion, or the fear that gnawed at her in the dark. She had become the caretaker, the strong one, shielding her mother from the harsh truths of her reality. This performance of strength was its own kind of exhaustion, adding another layer to her solitude. She was surrounded by people, yet she was profoundly, achingly alone with her burdens. The contrast between her life and the lives of the building's residents was a constant, dizzying assault on her senses. She moved through rooms larger than her entire apartment, filled with art she could never afford, and furniture that cost more than she made in a year. The silence in these spaces was different from her own. It was a silence of power, of choice, of a life insulated from the world's harsh realities. She would clean up the remnants of extravagant parties, wipe away wine stains from silk rugs, and feel like an archaeologist studying the artifacts of a foreign civilization. It wasn't jealousy that she felt, but a deep, unsettling sense of imbalance, a quiet rage at the injustice of a world so starkly divided between the haves and the have-nots. The large, elegant clock on the wall of the main lobby seemed to mock her with its slow, deliberate pace. Each tick was a second of her life spent in service, a moment she would never get back. The hours stretched into an eternity of polishing, scrubbing, and tidying, a monotonous loop that threatened to drain all color from her world. There were days when the urge to simply drop her cleaning cloth, walk out the door, and never return was almost overwhelming. But the image of the unpaid bills, of her mother's worried face, always held her back. So she would take a deep breath, focus on the task at hand, and push through, her resilience a silent, stubborn muscle that had been trained to endure, to bend without breaking. One evening, as she was finishing her last task, a wave of exhaustion washing over her, she noticed the private elevator to the penthouse was still open. It was a breach of protocol, something she was supposed to report. But Mrs. Gable had already left for the day, and Eliza was too tired to find another supervisor. A low, slurred voice, thick with anger and alcohol, drifted down from the hallway above. It was followed by a sharp, cracking sound, like glass breaking. Her training screamed at her to ignore it, to walk away and pretend she heard nothing. But a deeper instinct, the same one that defined her moral core, compelled her to take a step forward, her heart pounding a sudden, fearful rhythm against her ribs. She was moving toward the sound, toward the danger. The shift was not a sound, but a sudden, profound absence of it. The lieutenant's drunken taunts died in his throat, his body going rigid against hers. The oppressive heat of his presence was instantly replaced by an encroaching cold, a change in atmospheric pressure that made the hairs on Eliza's arms stand on end. A shadow had fallen over them, long and sharp in the dim hallway light, a figure of absolute stillness. She didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Power like that had its own gravity, pulling all light and sound into its orbit. The owner of this gilded cage had come home, and he had found a rat playing in his corridors. The silence that followed was a verdict waiting to be delivered, more terrifying than any shouted threat could ever be. Her eyes, against her will, lifted to meet his. Julian Thorne stood at the end of the hall, a sentinel carved from shadow and steel. His dark, impeccably tailored suit seemed to absorb the light around him, leaving only the stark white of his shirt and the pale, unreadable mask of his face. He wasn't looking at the terrified man pinning her to the wall. His gaze was fixed solely on her. His eyes were a deep, chilling gray, intelligent and utterly devoid of emotion. Yet they held an unnerving focus, as if he were cataloging every detail of her fear, her defiance, her soul. He was a man who commanded legions with a glance, and in that moment she was the sole focus of his silent, formidable empire. She felt not just seen, but dissected. A different kind of fear washed over Eliza, colder and more profound than the immediate physical threat she had just faced. This was not the brutish danger of a drunk, but the calculated, lethal calm of a predator. She was an intruder in his world, a speck of dust in his pristine, violent universe, and he was deciding whether to wipe her away or examine her under a microscope. Her training, her instincts, everything screamed at her to lower her gaze, to become the invisible maid once more, to blend into the marble and disappear. But something held her there, caught in the pull of his silent scrutiny. It was a strange, terrifying connection, a feeling of being recognized by a force she could not possibly comprehend. He saw the tremor in her hands, the tear on her uniform, the faint flush of shame on her cheeks. But he also saw what his lieutenant had missed entirely, the unbroken line of her spine, the fierce, defiant light that burned in her eyes, even as terror threatened to overwhelm her. It was a look of violated dignity, not of a victim begging for rescue. In her fragile, determined stance, he recognized a forgotten language of honor, a moral fortitude that had no place in his world of compromise and blood. She was an anomaly, a piece of raw, unyielding truth, in a life built on carefully constructed lies. And that single unexpected detail held his attention, a dissonant note in a perfectly composed, brutal symphony. Summoning a strength she did not know she possessed, Eliza broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, a mere whisper in the cavernous hall, yet it cut through the tension with the clarity of a bell. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her gaze never leaving Julian's, pointedly ignoring the man still pressed against her. I spilled some water. I'll clean it up right now." The lie was absurd, a fragile shield against a humiliating truth, but it was hers. It was an act of rebellion, a desperate claim to her own narrative. In that moment, she was not a victim to be saved. She was a woman refusing to be defined by her violation, choosing her own fiction over his sordid reality. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Julian's cold eyes. It was not pity or anger, but a sliver of what might have been respect. He understood the subtext of her words instantly. He lived in a world where people begged, betrayed, and bartered for their lives. No one had ever offered him a lie born of pure, unadulterated dignity. She was not asking for his help. She was protecting her own honor, even in the face of overwhelming power. This small, brave, and utterly foolish act resonated with a part of him he thought long dead, the part that still believed in an unwritten code, in strength that had nothing to do with violence, and everything to do with the will to remain whole. Without a word, Julian gave a nearly imperceptible nod to a man who seemed to materialize from the shadows behind him. The lieutenant was seized, his face draining of all color as a silent, efficient force pulled him away from Eliza. There were no pleas, no struggles, just the quiet, swift removal of a problem. The lieutenant vanished down the corridor, his fate sealed by a single silent gesture. The entire event was executed with the chilling precision of a well-oiled machine, a stark demonstration of Julian's absolute control. The implied violence of that silent dismissal was far more frightening than any open display of brutality could ever be. He did not need to raise his voice. The world simply rearranged itself to his will. The hallway fell silent again, but the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. The immediate threat was gone, but Eliza felt more exposed than ever, alone in the vast, empty space with the man who held her life in his hands. The cool marble against her back was the only solid thing in a world that had just tilted on its axis. She was still trembling, the adrenaline of the encounter leaving a metallic taste in her mouth. He had saved her, but it did not feel like salvation. It felt like a transaction, one whose terms she did not understand, and whose price she was terrified to learn. She was a pawn on his chessboard now, and she had no idea what game he was playing. He moved toward her then, his steps measured and silent on the polished floor. Each footfall echoed the frantic beating of her heart. He stopped just before her, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. She braced herself for a word, a question, a dismissal. Instead, he shrugged off his dark, exquisitely tailored jacket. The fabric whispered as he moved. With a gesture that was both unnervingly gentle and possessive, he draped it over her shoulders, the heavy wool settling around her like a shroud. The garment covered the tear in her uniform, hiding the evidence of her humiliation beneath its luxurious weight. The faint, clean scent of cedar and cold night air enveloped her, an intimate invasion of her senses. He did not speak. He simply held her gaze for one long, unendurable moment before turning and walking away, disappearing into the depths of the penthouse as silently as he had appeared. Eliza was left alone in the hallway, clutching the lapels of a jacket that was not hers. The warmth of the fabric seeped into her skin, a strange comfort that felt more like a brand. It was a gesture of protection that was also a claim, a shield that was also a cage. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life was no longer her own. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was filled with the weight of his presence, an echo that would follow her long into the darkness. The next morning, Eliza found the jacket neatly folded in a simple paper bag, the weight of it a burden in her hands. She marched to the penthouse, her resolve a brittle shield against the fear churning in her stomach. She found him in his home office, a vast expanse of glass and dark wood overlooking the city. He was a figure of stillness against the backdrop of a restless world, a file open before him, untouched. She placed the bag on the edge of his massive desk, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, sir. But I can't keep this." He didn't look up immediately, letting the silence stretch, forcing her to stand in his power. When his gray eyes finally met hers, they held no warmth, only a deep, unnerving assessment. It served its purpose, was all he said, a dismissal that was also an acknowledgement. She fled his presence, the cool, conditioned air of the hallway a relief against her flushed skin. But the feeling of his gaze followed her, a physical pressure on her back. She told herself it was over, a bizarre and terrifying chapter closed. She had returned his property, severed the strange, unspoken tie. Yet the memory of the jacket's scent, the heavy security of its weight, lingered like a ghost. She scrubbed floors with a renewed ferocity, trying to physically erase the encounter from her mind and body. She sought refuge in the familiar anonymity of her work, praying to become invisible once more, to be just another part of the building's silent machinery, a ghost in the halls of power. But she had been seen, and she knew with a dreadful certainty that some things, once seen, can never be unseen. Days bled into a week, and a fragile sense of normalcy began to return. Eliza worked with her head down, avoiding the upper floors, taking on extra shifts in the lower-level commercial spaces. One night, a brutal rainstorm lashed against the city, turning the streets into slick, dark mirrors. The last bus was delayed, and she stood shivering under a faulty awning, the cold seeping into her bones. A sleek black sedan, silent as a shark, pulled up to the curb before her. The window glided down, revealing a driver in a dark suit. "Miss Eliza," he said, his voice polite but absolute. "Mr. Thorne insisted I see you home safely." Panic flared in her chest. It was not a request. It was a summons, a reminder that she was still on his radar, a piece on his board. Her refusal was a weak protest, easily brushed aside by the driver's calm insistence. The back door opened, an invitation into a world she did not belong in. Defeated, she slid onto the plush leather seat. The interior of the car was a silent, climate-controlled cocoon, smelling faintly of cedar and something else, something that reminded her of him. The journey was made in absolute silence, the city lights a distant, blurry watercolor through the tinted windows. This calculated act of kindness was more terrifying than any threat. It was a demonstration of his reach, his ability to insert himself into her life at will. He was showing her that there was no distance she could create that he could not effortlessly bridge, no wall she could build, that he could not see over. He was everywhere. From the silent sanctuary of his penthouse, Julian watched her, not with the invasive eye of a stalker, but with the detached focus of a strategist studying an unpredictable variable. He had access to the building's security feeds, and he found himself pulling up the footage from the service corridors, watching her move with quiet, determined grace. He saw her share her meager lunch with another maid, saw her pause to stare out a window at the distant lake, a flicker of profound loneliness in her expression. She was a study in contrasts, fragile in her circumstances yet possessing a core of unbendable steel. This quiet integrity was a foreign concept in his world, a light so pure it threatened to expose the depths of his own darkness. He knew he should leave her alone. She was an innocent, and his world fed on innocence. To draw her closer was to mark her for destruction, to taint her with the blood and compromise that defined his existence. Every instinct for self-preservation, the same instincts that had kept him alive and in power for years, screamed at him to cut this burgeoning fascination off at the root. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, and she was a creature of the light. Bringing her into his orbit was a reckless, selfish act. Yet, the memory of her defiant eyes, of her absurd, honorable lie, kept pulling him back. For the first time in a decade, he felt something other than the cold calculus of power, a protective impulse that was as dangerous as it was undeniable. Their worlds collided again in the hushed, opulent dining room of a hotel he owned. Eliza had taken a waitressing shift for a friend, desperate for the extra money. She was balancing a tray of champagne flutes when she saw him. He was seated at a corner table, flanked by two men whose stillness was more menacing than any weapon. Their conversation was a low murmur, but the air around them crackled with power and implicit danger. And then he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room as if a magnetic force had guided his gaze. The noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses and silverware, the soft music, it all faded into a dull roar. There was only the silent, charged line of sight connecting them. He gave no sign of surprise, only a slow, deliberate blink of acknowledgement. It was a gesture that claimed her, that separated her from everyone else in the room. Her hand trembled, a single glass rattling on the tray. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, though no one else had noticed the silent exchange. For the rest of the night, she felt the weight of his attention, a constant, unnerving presence at the edge of her perception. He never looked directly at her again, but she knew he was aware of her every movement. She was a moth, and he was a flame, and she was terrified of how badly she wanted to see if she would burn, or if his fire was the only source of warmth in her cold, lonely world. A war began to rage within her. The man at that table was everything she had been taught to fear and despise. A purveyor of violence, a master of a corrupt and broken system. He was the darkness her father had warned her about, the kind of power that consumes and destroys. Every rational part of her mind screamed at her to run, to disappear, to find another job in another city. But then she would remember the unexpected gentleness with which he had covered her torn uniform, the protective silence of the car ride home. She was seeing glimpses of a man haunted by his own power, a man whose eyes held a loneliness that mirrored her own. This duality was a dangerous hook, pulling her in, making her question everything she thought she knew about good and evil. She fought the fascination with every fiber of her being, channeling her energy into her work, into the endless cycle of paying bills and calling her mother. She tried to convince herself that what she felt was just fear, a natural reaction to a powerful man's attention. But it was more complicated than that. It was the terrifying, magnetic pull of being truly seen. In his world, she was not just a maid, she was a person of interest, an anomaly he could not categorize. And in a life spent being invisible, that focused attention, however dangerous, felt like a powerful, addictive drug. She was afraid of him, but she was becoming more afraid of the part of herself that did not want him to look away. Julian, too, was losing his battle for control. During a tense negotiation with a rival faction, a meeting where a single misspoken word could lead to bloodshed, he found his thoughts drifting to the determined set of her jaw. His second-in-command, a man who had known him for 20 years, had to repeat a question twice before Julian registered it. This lapse was unprecedented. He was known for his unshakable focus, his ability to compartmentalize and control every situation. But Eliza had become a breach in his defenses, a persistent, quiet thought that disrupted the cold, brutal logic that governed his life. She was a distraction he could not afford, a vulnerability he had sworn never to allow himself again. He saw the irony in his conflict. He, who could orchestrate the rise and fall of fortunes with a single phone call, was being undone by the quiet dignity of a maid. She represented a moral clarity he had long since sacrificed, a simple, unyielding sense of right and wrong that he both admired and resented. To protect her, he had to keep her at a distance, to leave her in her world of quiet struggles and simple honor. But the impulse to pull her into his, to shield her with the very power that would ultimately corrupt her, was growing stronger every day. He was caught between the man he was and the man her presence made him wish he could be. The tension was becoming unbearable. The inevitable finally happened in the confines of a service elevator. She was transporting a cart of linens when the doors opened and he stepped inside. The space was small, the air instantly thick with his presence. He stood near the control panel, she stood by her cart, a chasm of a few feet between them that felt both immense and non-existent. Neither of them spoke as the elevator began its slow ascent. She could hear the soft sound of his breathing over the hum of the machinery, could smell that faint, clean scent of cedar and cold air. She kept her eyes fixed on the changing floor numbers, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, praying for the ride to end. As the elevator jolted to a stop at his floor, the cart shifted, and a stack of folded towels began to slide. Instinctively, they both reached for it at the same time. His hand covered hers, his long, cool fingers pressing against her skin for a barest fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp shock that jolted through her entire body. She snatched her hand back as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a flicker of the same startled surprise she felt. The air crackled, charged with the unspoken energy of that single, accidental touch. The moment was broken only by the soft chime of the elevator doors sliding open. The next day, the storm broke, but it was not one of Julian's making. Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of sour resentment, cornered Eliza in the laundry room. Her jealousy, fueled by whispers of the black car and the special attention, had finally boiled over. "I know what you're doing," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You think you're special, don't you? Flirting with the residents? Getting gifts?" She thrust a hand into Eliza's locker, pulling out a small, inexpensive silver locket, a gift from her late father. "What's this? Something you stole from one of the apartments?" The accusation was absurd, but Mrs. Gable's eyes held a cruel, triumphant glint. She'd been waiting for an excuse. Eliza stood her ground, her voice shaking but firm. "That was my father's. Put it back." The demand only enraged the supervisor further. "You're fired, you little thief. I'm calling security right now. They'll be very interested to hear how you've been manipulating Mr. Thorne." The threat hung in the air, a promise of ruin. Eliza's world began to crumble. Losing this job meant losing everything: her apartment, her ability to support her mother, the last vestiges of her hard-won stability. She was trapped, her integrity weaponized against her, her future about to be destroyed by a petty, bitter lie. The injustice of it was a bitter pill, a final, crushing blow. A cold draft swept through the humid room, and the temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway, a figure of absolute, silent authority. He had not been summoned. He had simply appeared, drawn by some unseen instinct. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Mrs. Gable's malicious sneer, Eliza's pale, defiant face, the silver locket clutched in the supervisor's hand. He moved into the room, his steps making no sound on the concrete floor. He did not look at Eliza. His chilling gray eyes were fixed solely on Mrs. Gable, a gaze that stripped away all her bluster, leaving only raw, naked fear. He stopped before her and spoke, his voice a quiet, lethal whisper that cut through the air. "She is with me." The two simple words hung in the humid air. A sentence passed and a law decreed. "She is with me." Mrs. Gable's face, which had been a mask of cruel triumph, collapsed into a canvas of pure, unadulterated terror. The authority she wielded in these service corridors was a flickering candle next to the inferno of Julian Thorne's power. His voice, though quiet, had the finality of a coffin lid closing. It was a statement of ownership, a line drawn in the concrete floor that no one would dare cross. He had not raised his voice, had not made a threat, but in that moment, he had reordered the universe around this one trembling woman. The whirring of the industrial dryer seemed to fall silent, holding its breath in the face of his absolute, chilling command. Eliza felt the world tilt, the ground shifting beneath her feet. His words were a shield, but they were also a cage, locking her into a fate she could neither comprehend nor escape. The fear of losing her job was instantly replaced by a far deeper, more primal terror. To be with him meant being part of his world, a world of shadows and unspoken violence. It was a protection that came at the cost of her anonymity, her simple, honest life. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a savior, but a king, claiming a new, unwilling subject for his dark kingdom. A strange, bewildering warmth spread through her chest, a terrifying gratitude for the man who was simultaneously saving and damning her with a single, possessive phrase. Without breaking his gaze from the terrified supervisor, Julian extended a hand, palm up. It was not a request. It was a silent, non-negotiable demand. Mrs. Gable's hand trembled so violently that the silver locket rattled against her fingers. With fumbling haste, as if touching a hot coal, she dropped the small piece of jewelry into his waiting palm. He closed his fingers around it, his movements slow and deliberate, each motion a calculated display of power. He had not touched her, had not threatened her, but he had taken something from her with an authority that was more violating than any physical force. He had stripped her of her petty power and left her utterly exposed, a lesson delivered in absolute, brutal silence. Julian turned to Eliza, and the chilling mask of his authority softened, just for a moment, into something unreadable, something almost human. His cold gray eyes held a flicker of an emotion she couldn't name. He opened his hand, the locket resting in his palm, a fragile piece of her past held by the most dangerous man she had ever met. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he took a step closer and gently placed it into her open, trembling palm, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was a spark in the cold room, a brief, searing touch that felt more intimate than a kiss. It was the transfer of more than just an object. It was a promise, a brand, a silent contract being sealed between them. His attention returned to Mrs. Gable, his expression once again unreadable and cold as marble. "You are no longer employed here. Leave the premises." His voice was flat, devoid of anger or any emotion at all, which made the decree all the more terrifying. It was a simple statement of fact, a life altered with a few quiet words. Mrs. Gable, her face ashen, gave a spastic nod, unable to form a reply. She turned and practically fled the room, her escape a clumsy, panicked scramble from the presence of a predator who had decided she was no longer worth his notice. The sound of her retreating footsteps echoed in the sudden, profound silence she left behind, a silence now filled with the unspoken weight of Julian's transgression. Now they were alone. The laundry room, a place of mundane labor, had become a sacred, terrifying space. The air was thick with the consequences of his actions. He had broken his own code of invisibility and detachment, intervening in the life of a civilian, exposing an interest that could be perceived as a weakness by his enemies. Eliza clutched the locket in her hand, the metal now warm from his touch. It felt heavier than it ever had before, imbued with the weight of his choice. She was no longer just a maid. She was the woman he had publicly claimed, the reason a powerful man had shattered his own rules. The silence between them was a living thing, pulsing with questions and dangers. Finding a voice she didn't know she had, Eliza broke her own rule of quiet deference. She looked directly into his eyes, her fear warring with a desperate need to understand. Why? The word was a fragile breath, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. It was not a question of gratitude. It was a challenge. It demanded a truth from a man who lived by secrets and lies. She was asking him to explain the inexplicable, to give a name to the force that had compelled him to step out of the shadows and into her life. In that single word, she ceased to be a pawn and became a player, demanding to know the rules of the game he had forced her into. Julian's composure fractured for a fraction of a second. The question hit him like a bullet, bypassing all his defenses. He had no answer that would make sense in her world, or even in his. He could speak of honor, of the unexpected sight of her defiance, but those were just words. The truth was a chaotic, unfamiliar feeling churning in his gut, a violent protective instinct he hadn't felt since he was a boy, before his heart had been encased in ice. He looked at her, at the raw courage in her wide, frightened eyes, and he saw a mirror to a part of himself he had murdered long ago. He couldn't explain it because he didn't understand it himself. He only knew that her quiet integrity had become his anchor and his undoing. He took a half step toward her, closing the small distance between them. The air crackled with a tension that was both terrifying and sacred. He slowly raised his hand, and she flinched, a small, involuntary movement that seemed to cause him a visible pang of pain. His fingers, long and elegant, hesitated in the air before gently, almost reverently, tucking a stray strand of her dark hair behind her ear. The touch was featherlight, a whisper of contact against her skin, yet it carried the entire weight of his confession. It was an act of impossible tenderness, a gesture of a man drowning in a darkness of his own making, reaching for a single small point of light. It was his surrender. Just as quickly as it happened, it was over. He retracted his hand as if her skin had burned him, the mask of cold control slamming back into place. The brief, fragile connection was severed, leaving a void that was colder than before. Without another word, without a backward glance, he turned and walked out of the laundry room, his footsteps echoing down the concrete corridor until they faded into nothing. Eliza was left standing alone, the scent of cedar and cold night air lingering in his wake. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and the locket in her hand was a warm, heavy weight. The world was utterly silent, but in her soul a storm had just begun. Nothing would ever be the same again. The silence Julian left behind was a physical entity, heavier than the humid air in the laundry room. Eliza stood frozen, her fingers wrapped tightly around the silver locket, its metal a warm, solid anchor in a world that had just liquefied. The rhythmic thumping of the industrial dryers, which had faded into the background, now returned with a deafening roar, each rotation a measure of time restarting in a new, terrifying reality. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his fingers against her skin, a touch that had branded her more deeply than any physical mark. He had stepped out of the shadows to claim her, and in doing so had cast an even larger, more permanent shadow over her entire life. She was no longer invisible. She was his, and she had no idea what that meant, other than the chilling certainty that her quiet, anonymous existence was over forever. The consequences were swift, but delivered with the same silent, unnerving efficiency as his protection. The next morning, she was not summoned to an office or publicly reprimanded. Instead, a new supervisor, a bland, emotionless man she had never seen before, met her by the lockers. He handed her a new work schedule without meeting her eye. She had been reassigned to the building's corporate floors, a maze of sterile offices and empty conference rooms far from the residential penthouses. It was a promotion in title, but an exile in practice. She was being protected by being removed, isolated within the same walls. Julian's power was a ghost in the machine, rearranging her life with invisible hands, creating a safe, unbreachable distance between them that felt more like a punishment than a reprieve. From his perch high above the city, Julian watched the rain lash against the panoramic windows of his penthouse. The storm outside was a pale reflection of the one raging within him. Intervening in the laundry room was a catastrophic lapse in judgment, a strategic error born from an emotion he had long since buried. In his world, any perceived attachment was a vulnerability, an open wound for his enemies to pour salt into. He knew the whispers had already started among his rivals, the quiet probing for a weakness in the impenetrable armor of Julian Thorne. To keep Eliza safe, he had to become a ghost to her, to erase himself from her life as completely as he had erased Mrs. Gable. It was a cold, brutal calculus, the only kind he knew, and it required him to sacrifice the one thing that had made him feel human again. Eliza's days fell into a new, hollow rhythm. The work on the corporate floors was monotonous, cleaning spaces that were empty by the time she arrived. The oppressive scrutiny of Mrs. Gable was gone, but so was the electric tension, the terrifying possibility of seeing him in a hallway or an elevator. The silence that had once been her refuge now felt like a vast, echoing void. She would polish the long, reflective surface of a boardroom table and see only her own lonely image staring back. His absence was a constant, palpable presence, a ghost that walked beside her down the empty corridors. She was safe, she was employed, but she had been moved from one cage into another, this one quieter, colder, and infinitely more isolating, defined not by walls but by the space he no longer occupied. The ripples of his transgression spread silently through the underworld. During a tense meeting in a dimly lit steakhouse, a rival syndicate leader, a man with eyes like a smiling shark, made a casual remark about the importance of keeping one's personal life separate from business. The comment was light, almost friendly, but it was a perfectly aimed probe, a test of Julian's composure. Julian met his gaze with an unnerving stillness, his expression unreadable, and calmly changed the subject. But the message was clear. His moment of humanity was now a liability. That night, he made a ruthless decision that crippled his rival's operations, a move of such cold precision that it sent a clear, brutal message to everyone. Julian Thorne had no weaknesses. The act left a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth, a stark reminder of the man he had to be. Back in her small apartment, Eliza would stand by her window for hours, watching the indifferent lights of the city blink in the darkness. The initial shock and terror began to recede, slowly replaced by a painful, sharpening lucidity. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, a pawn moved by powerful forces. His intervention had forced her to see the world as it truly was, a complex web of power, loyalty, and brutal consequences. The pain of her new reality was not just a burden, it was a lens, clarifying her own strength. She had looked a monster in the eye and had not broken. She'd survived his world, and now she had to survive his absence. This quiet, lonely vigil was not one of self-pity, but of transformation, the forging of a new, more resilient self in the crucible of her fear. One afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived for her mother. Inside was a cashier's check for an amount that would cover the last of her father's outstanding medical debts. There was no note, no return address, no explanation. It was an anonymous, untraceable act of immense generosity that could only have come from one person. Eliza held the check in her hands, the paper feeling both as heavy as lead and as light as a ghost's touch. This was his way of watching over her, a gesture from across the chasm he had created between them. It was not a kindness, it was a chain, another invisible link binding her to him. The relief she should have felt was tangled with a chilling sense of obligation, a reminder that even in his absence, she was still under his silent, watchful dominion. Weeks bled into a month. The large clock on her kitchen wall seemed to tick louder in the silence, each second. A small, sharp reminder of the time stretching between now and her last encounter with him. She replayed the scene in the laundry room 1,000 times, dissecting every glance, every gesture, every unspoken word. His question, why, echoed in the empty spaces of her apartment. The answer she sought was not in what he had said, but in what he had done, the impossible tenderness of his touch, the raw vulnerability that had flickered in his eyes for a fraction of a second. The silence that had fallen between them was no longer an absence of sound. It had become a language of its own, heavy with the weight of everything they could never say to each other. Julian sat alone in his vast, silent penthouse, a glass of amber liquor untouched on the table beside him. He was surrounded by priceless art, listening to a rare vinyl recording of a somber cello suite, but the luxury that had once been his armor now felt like the architecture of his isolation. He had successfully reasserted his control, quelled the rumors, and fortified his empire. He was more powerful and feared than ever before. But in the polished reflection of the glass, he didn't see a king. He saw the face of a man who had willingly walked back into his own prison. He had pushed her away to protect her, but in doing so, he had locked himself away from the only source of light his dark world had ever known, leaving him utterly, profoundly alone. The autumn air grew colder, and Eliza began to find a fragile peace in her solitude. She enrolled in a night class for architectural drafting, using the newfound freedom from debt to reclaim a small piece of the woman she used to be. She no longer looked for him in the building's corridors or jumped when a black car drove past. The fear had finally subsided, replaced by a quiet, resilient strength. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake with the distinct memory of cedar and cold air, a phantom scent that lingered like an unresolved chord. The connection between them had not been broken. It had simply gone dormant, a silent, powerful current, running deep beneath the surface of their separate lives, waiting for the day it would inevitably be forced to rise again. A year later, the city unveiled a new public library, a soaring structure of glass and reclaimed steel that seemed to defy gravity. Eliza was there, not as a cleaner, but as a guest. She had won a student award for a design concept, and her presence at the opening gala was a quiet testament to her new life. She wore a simple dark blue dress, her posture straight, her gaze no longer fixed on the floor, but on the architectural marvels around her. The familiar ache of solitude had softened into a quiet self-possession. She moved through the elegant crowd with a grace that was now born not of sorrow, but of a hard-won peace. She was no longer hiding. She was finally, tentatively, beginning to build. Then, the atmosphere in the grand hall shifted. It was a subtle change, a hush that fell over the ambient chatter, a sudden stillness in the fluid movement of the crowd. She felt it before she saw him, a familiar, chilling drop in the temperature that was imprinted on her memory. Julian Thorne stood across the room, near an archway, a figure of immaculate darkness against the bright, open space. He was speaking to the mayor, his expression as unreadable as ever, but his power was a palpable force, bending the light and sound around him. Her heart gave a single, painful thud against her ribs, a ghost of a fear she thought she had buried, a memory of a man who was both her protector and her captor. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head. His eyes, gray and cold as a winter sea, found hers instantly across the crowded expanse. The distance between them, filled with 100 strangers and a year of silence, collapsed into nothing. It was a moment suspended in time, a silent, searing conversation held in a single, unbroken stare. He saw not the frightened maid in a torn uniform, but a woman standing in her own light, her resilience forged into a quiet, unshakable strength. She saw not the terrifying Mafia Boss, but the profound, aching loneliness of a king trapped in a kingdom of his own making, a man haunted by the ghost of his own humanity. He gave no sign of recognition that anyone else could decipher. There was no smile, no overt gesture, but he gave her a nod, so slight it was almost imperceptible. It was not a greeting or an acknowledgment of a past acquaintance. It was a release, a quiet benediction. It was the final, unspoken word in their story, an admission of his sacrifice and an affirmation of her freedom. With that single silent gesture, he turned away, melting back into the shadows of the powerful men around him. A moment later he was gone, his departure as discreet and absolute as his arrival, leaving behind only the faintest echo of his presence in the suddenly lighter air. Eliza did not look away. She watched the space where he had been standing, a strange hollow ache blooming in her chest. It was not pain but closure. She unconsciously raised a hand to her collarbone, where the small silver locket rested beneath her dress, its metal cool against her skin. He had paid her father's debts, but this final, silent act was the one that truly set her free. He had walked into her life to protect her honor, and had walked out of it to preserve her soul. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air filling her lungs with the promise of a future that was, for the first time, entirely her own to design, a blank page waiting for her to draw the first line. He returned to his world of shadows, and she stepped forward into a world of light, both of them forever marked by the silent bond they had forged in a dark hallway. Their story is a testament to the fact that redemption is not always about absolution, but about a single, selfless choice that allows another soul to find peace. If their journey touched your heart, share this story, leave a like, and tell us in the comments if you believe that even the most broken person can be a catalyst for grace. For in the end, some souls are not meant to be saved, but are simply and finally set free.